Let's get down to business. As he said, my name is Kody Gerkin. From the USA, I did volunteer with the Peace Corps in Guatemala for several years. And during those experiences, a big part of the process is sort of the cultural immersion piece. So since the first couple of days that I spent in Guatemala, I've really been fascinated about what becomes possible when you cross cultural boundaries. So the central idea of my talk today is that all of us, each and every one of us, can contribute to the breakdown of barriers through an understanding of multiculturalism and through an understanding of the importance of multiculturalism. So first we'll talk about multiculturalism and how it helps and sometimes hurts us as we try to cross these cultural boundaries. And then, as the title suggests, we will use Maíz, Spanish for corn, and corn's importance to the Maya in Guatemala as a bridge to multicultural understanding. So before we begin, I just want to say that crossing boundaries or multiculturalism does not mean a variety of things. Chief among them in the context of my talk is that this concept of no boundaries does not mean converting other people to be more like you, or to be more like me, or to be more alike in general. No boundaries does not mean agreeing all of the time. It doesn't mean not honoring and recognizing our own cultural baggage and the cultural knowledge bases that we bring with us in every social interaction. It also does not mean practicing colorblindness. For me, and I think for a healthier world, difference is really, really important and should actually be valued as opposed to be ignored. So again, for the context of my talk, crossing boundaries demands an understanding of multiculturalism. So let's start with multi. I wrote pretty basic. We know what that means. Many, varied, that there are a lot of components. Culture gets a little bit trickier, and I actually had sent out a questionnaire about what culture means, and I was actually pretty impressed with the variety of responses. Oftentimes, folks will think about culture in a relatively generic sense, things that kind of, when you first meet someone or first interact with a new culture, the things that you can see kind of represent them culturally, perhaps the food that they eat or the way that they dress or carry themselves, right? So I want to think about culture like this as part of the truth, but not the whole truth. So I'm asking you to think about culture as a layered concept. We begin with the concrete, which, like the leaves of a tree, are the most striking elements of a culture, the things that you see at first glance. The bright clothes that someone wears, or other examples of this concrete level include food, music. When you have a multicultural celebration, let's say Celebrate Guatemala Night, what would you do? You might dress in the clothing and eat the food and listen to the music, right? That's a layer of culture. Thinking about culture in a little bit more deeply, we get to the behavioral, which are a little less easy to see, like the branches and the trunk of a tree. They're things like social roles, the language that you speak, your family structure, nonverbal communication. Things you can still see, but they're not quite as easy to pick out, right? Sometimes you're blinded by the vibrance of a culture on the surface, right? But I'm challenging people to think about getting a little bit deeper. And then we get to things like the symbolic, for which there is no arrow, because you can't see the symbolic things that make up, you can't see the symbolic aspects of a particular person's cultural makeup. Things like their values, belief systems, their spirituality, their religion, their worldview. These are symbolic cultural manifestations of each of us as an individual. Now, when you think about these things, and I'll give you a moment to think about them, I want you to think about which of these layers is most important to you. When you think about your own cultural makeup, how you define yourself culturally, is it the clothes that you wear, the food that you eat, the language you speak, how you interact with others socially? Or at the core of your being, do you have things like a belief system or a particular worldview that's been, crafted over years of experience living in this world, right? Now, when you meet somebody or enter a new culture, which of these categories do you use to understand your new environment or your new friend? Do we use the concrete? Do we use the behavioral? Do we use the symbolic? We kind of default to whichever is the most obvious. So I meet someone or I enter a new culture, and I'm kind of starting to make assumptions about them already based on the way that they dress, the way they carry themselves, the language they speak, the food they eat. And as we've explored, these are all examples of that kind of concrete level of culture, right? Now, as an example, how many people in this room are Qatari? If you don't mind me asking. All right. So being new here to Qatar, I'm still sifting through this. I don't know what to make of Qatari people culturally. I'm still learning, I'm still observing, and we'll get to some of those points later. But someone could come to Doha, someone could come to Qatar and see that women wear abayas and men go to Souk Waqif and smoke shisha and people eat lamb and they drink tea. Does that mean that I really understand anything about Qatari culture or anything about one individual Qatari person? Because I know that a lot of Qatari people drink tea? But these are the kind of assumptions that we operate on when we meet new people, when we enter new cultures. So I want to ask you to think about this a little bit when you enter a new culture or you meet a new friend, these kind of categories that we immediately put them in, the kind of simplifications that we make rather quickly. And a really important question to ask ourselves, and the sort of purpose of the first half of my talk, is this consistent with how we view ourselves? Excuse me. Is this cultural understanding of others, is it consistent with how we want to be viewed and understood, culturally or otherwise? And particularly in this context, as an Anglo-white male from the United States, what forces in our global society might contribute to our simplification of other cultures? So what are the pressures at play to make me want to understand people more simplistically? Well, it makes it easier for me to navigate in the world. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing. Assuming that because I know that women in Qatar wear an abaya and drink tea, that that's the end of Qatari culture, that's all I need to know, that would leave the world in a pretty shallow, dangerous place, right? Even though it might be easier, and that we all are guilty of it at times. So, thinking about the concepts we've explored, I want you to just sort of couch that first half of the talk for a little while, and I want you to think about what you see in these pictures. Take a few moments. Now, breathtaking. I'll give you just a moment to just soak those images in because they're so beautiful to me. On the right here, we have Tikal, one of the largest. I took both of these pictures actually over the last. The picture on the right there I took just this past summer in 2010, and the one on the left in 2006. This is in Copan, Honduras, right on the border between Guatemala and Honduras, and this is in Tikal in the northern jungles of Guatemala. Thousands of years ago, the Mayan people in Guatemala, the indigenous people in Guatemala, southern Mexico, and Central America, were building pyramid monuments to their gods and carving intricate sculptures to honor their heroes. The Popol Vuh is similar, actually, to the last talk, the idea of these, the song lines, I believe that they're called. The Popol Vuh is kind of a similar concept. It's nowadays, it's kind of considered the Mayan Bible, but for a long time, it was handed down orally through the generations. And only after the conquest of the Spanish did it, in its hieroglyphic forms and as an oral tradition, become written down in Spanish. But it contains what, according to the Mayan people, who are the indigenous people in Guatemala, again in southern Mexico, consider to be the beginnings of the world. So the gods in the Popol Vuh, the story is such that the gods conspired, and they created first the heaven and the earth, and they created the water from the land, and they created animals, the flora and fauna. They created animals that are very important to Maya still today, the quetzal bird. They created jaguars, snakes, the types of animals you'll find in the jungles of Guatemala. And they also created monkeys, which were actually their first attempt at creating man. They created monkeys, but it didn't come out very well. And this is, according to the Maya, why we find monkeys today. It was an attempt at making humans, which failed in the eyes of the gods. Secondly, they decided to create men of another substance. They used mud, but discovered that they withered away in the water, and they didn't make very effective human beings. So they made yet another attempt to make man by using wood, but found that they could neither think nor talk, and when they walked really poorly. And so that didn't work either. So they scrapped the idea of making men out of wood. And the gods convened one last time in an attempt to make human beings, and they decided to use corn, that they would fashion men of corn. And in their infinite wisdom, the gods the gods succeeded. They made men of corn, and it worked. And the men were grateful for having been formed and could see the things about them and take pleasure in them and be thankful for their existence. So corn becomes very important in ancient Mayan culture and through to today. Actually, Guatemalan men today consider themselves hombres de maíz. They're men of corn. The people in Guatemala, literally the indigenous people, are people of corn, men of corn. So if you hadn't known this, and let's say you traveled to Guatemala as a journalist or as a student or as a worker in any capacity, a development worker, or to establish business relations, and you see these types of images, the one in the upper right-hand corner, somos hombres de maíz sembrando ideas, we are men of corn planting ideas. And you see in these other images something that looks like corn sort of as the life force of the person, or Mayan cosmology, the Mayans have a very important part of their understanding of the world is the role that human beings play in the ecosystem. And so you see that depicted in this image, and you also see the importance of corn. Had you not known these things, these pieces of art might not have really made a lot of sense, right? It looks like corn is important, but we don't know why, and it seems like they eat a lot of corn. That's kind of a concrete cultural manifestation of corn, right? And that flowed with my understanding of food and what it could represent in culture when I arrived in Guatemala. Corn would appear to be a concrete representation of culture in Guatemala. There's corn everywhere. Every time you sit down to eat a meal, you get a big stack of corn tortillas, or corn in some other form. They make a wide variety, like more than you could possibly imagine. There are more words in Guatemala in both indigenous and Spanish, indigenous languages and the Spanish language to refer to corn in all of its many forms. It's an amazing thing. It's really an amazing thing. But to me, coming from the US, food is a concrete representation of culture. We have hamburgers and we have apple pie. That doesn't really mean anything, right? I mean, they're concrete cultural representations. Yes, they're cultural representations, but there really isn't much meaning there. So for me, I had to shed some of my cultural biases, and that was really crucial to my ability to understand Mayan culture and to understand the importance of corn and Maya culture in general. A big takeaway lesson from this talk, central to my idea, is that culture isn't static. What might be a concrete representation of culture in one example is in fact a behavioral or perhaps a symbolic. But you have to be thinking about these things before entering a new culture in order to give yourself time to have these lessons stick or be meaningful to you or helpful to you in any way. So think about these images again. Think about what you see a second time. A concrete cultural lens, perhaps the first time you were glancing at them, and for me it's a woman in bright colored clothing. That's actually me in my front yard in Guatemala. You can see how tall the corn grows from millennia of breeding it to produce as much corn per stalk as possible. And this is a house. You might not have noticed the first time. It's actually surrounded by corn. They'll grow corn in the rainy season and dry it for the dry season so that they can have corn tortillas year-round. Now, when you begin to investigate these kinds of things and you observe the importance of corn in Mayan culture, you might begin to develop a symbolic cultural lens with which to view the importance of culture in Maya civilization. And what I came to see through this symbolic lens was these images show me people living amongst their life force and honoring their cultural heritage every single day, which is fundamentally different from what we see when we look at it with that concrete cultural lens. So to cross boundaries effectively, to be able to make that shift, to function successfully in a different culture, we have to think about our own cultural knowledge bases and the baggage that we bring with us. We have to study the culture that we're entering before we make an attempt to cross that cultural boundary. We have to observe once we arrive as much as we interact. The Peace Corps is a 27-month commitment. And the first 3 months you spend in training, the following 3 months they send you to the site you're going to be working in, and they essentially ask you to hang out for another 3 months. They encourage you not to hit the ground running, essentially, because they know the importance of observing the culture in the place where you're going to be working, having enough time to soak up the work environment before you're expected to excel in that environment. It's really, really important, as far as I'm concerned, in an attempt to cross cultural boundaries successfully, that you give yourself time to observe as much as you interact. And also, crucial, avoid overestimating your own ability to have crossed that boundary successfully. For example, oh, Qatari culture, yeah, sure, I know that. Let's drink some tea and have some. That doesn't mean anything. And I think a lot of people make that mistake. They have a sense that they understand Qatari culture based on these very, very, very concrete concepts of the culture in Qatar or in the Middle East in general. So a lot of people will make this attempt to cross a boundary, come up across that cultural boundary, and not be able to cross it successfully. And they might actually end up clinging to what they know, returning to their culture of origin. They see other people coming up against that cultural boundary and having the same difficulties. And eventually they succumb to, racism or ethnocentrism. We do it better in our culture than they do. And they don't attempt to cross that boundary. But if we study about the culture that we're entering, if we give ourselves time to observe, if we're aware of these layers of culture and how we internalize them, that kind of cultural baggage that we bring, we can cross those cultural boundaries successfully. We're still the same person when we've crossed the boundary, and we still bring our cultural knowledge bases with us, but we've crossed that boundary successfully. We're able to interact with people without making those sort of shallow, concrete cultural judgments. And if enough people cross that boundary successfully, the boundary itself is rendered less important. It's less meaningful. And eventually, the boundaries begin to dissolve. The cultural boundaries that separate us begin to dissolve. And we arrive at a place where there are no boundaries. If we can grasp these different levels of culture and begin to make these distinctions between the concrete, the behavioral, and the symbolic, we become culturally competent global citizens. And we, all of us, contribute to a world with less boundaries, less important boundaries, less meaningful boundaries, and eventually work towards a world in which there are no boundaries. Thank you.